Good morning, colleagues. The 9,033rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Thomas Markram, Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Thomas Markram.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I would like to extend my appreciation to Council members for the opportunity to brief you this morning. I'm aware that the Russian Federation has submitted new information regarding allegations of biological weapons programs in Ukraine. I wish to note that Under Secretary General Nakamitsu informed the Council in her respective briefings on 11 and 18 March 2022 that the United Nations was not aware of any biological weapons programs in Ukraine. This remains the case today. I would like to note that the United Nations currently has neither the mandate nor the technical or operational capacity to investigate this information. I recall that the relevant instrument of international law is the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, which prohibits the development, production, acquisition, transfer, stockpiling, and use of biological and toxin weapons. The Russian Federation, the United States, and Ukraine are all states parties to the Biological Weapons Convention. Mr. President, the Biological Weapons Convention does contain several measures to which concerned states parties can have recourse in order to address situations in which they have concerns or suspicions about the activities of their peers. For example, pursuant to Article 5 of the Convention, its states parties undertake to consult one another and to cooperate in solving any problems which may arise in relation to the objective of or in the application of the provisions of the Convention. Such consultation and cooperation can take place through appropriate international procedures, including on a bilateral basis between the concerned states parties. One such international procedure that has been elaborated within the framework of the Biological Weapons Convention is the convening of a consultative meeting. Other possibilities for addressing concerns between states parties also exist under Article 5 of the Convention as well as under Article 6. I would therefore encourage any states parties with compliance concerns to use the procedures available under the Convention. The United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs stands ready to support any procedures under the Biological Weapons Convention that states parties may decide to use. As Under Secretary General Nakamitsu has mentioned in her previous statements to the Council, the Biological Weapons Convention needs to be operationalized and institutionalized to ensure it is properly equipped and resourced to face future challenges. The Convention's upcoming 9th Review Conference in November and December this year presents a real opportunity for its states parties to strengthen the Convention. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Mr. Markram for his briefing. I will now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. First on the speakers list, I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, Russia has asked for a meeting on the military biological activity of Ukraine for the third time now. I'll explain why. We continue to receive very worrying documentary evidence of the fact that the Ministry of Defense of the United States is directly involved in carrying out in the country dangerous biological projects that look like a secret biological military program. This activity is being carried out in the centre of Eastern Europe and on the western borders of Russia. It is a real threat to the biosecurity of our country, the region, and, given the cross-border nature of these biothreats, to the whole world. There is no information on this in the reporting stipulated by the Bio and Toxin Weapons Convention from Ukraine or from the United States, as was confirmed by Mr. Markram. Preventing this dangerous activity is possible only through our special military operation. Since the previous meeting, 2 months have passed and we've received much new evidence. All of these materials we have placed on through the Security Council, and I'd like to draw your attention to the most salient pieces of information here. As comes from the documentation on Project 3007, monitoring of epidemiological and the environmental situation with the proliferation in Ukraine of dangerous waterborne diseases, Ukrainian specialists, under the supervision of American colleagues, have regularly carried out collection of water samples from rivers flowing through Ukraine, including the Dnieper, the Danube and the Dniester, and also the North Crimean Canal. The aim here is to establish the presence in them of specific dangerous pathogens, including cholera, typhoid, hepatitis A and E, and to evaluate the way in which they spread through the water in order to draw conclusions on the ability of these pathogens to incapacitate. Then the collections of these samples were sent to the United States. We have a logical question. Why? Why is a collection of dangerous pathogens being collected by the United States, which might then spread through the waters of this region? Even a look at a Ukrainian map of the water sources in that country is enough to understand that the results of this scientific experiment might be used to create a biological catastrophe, not only in Russia, but on the whole through the waters of the Azov and Black Seas and in Eastern Europe, including Belarus, Moldova and Poland. The documents say that the Kiev regime is trying to receive access to the technical means to deliver dangerous bioagents through the air. Last year, the Ukrainian side asked the Turkish manufacturer of drones, Baykar Makina, whether it was possible to equip the drone Bayraktar with an aerosol equipment that would allow it to spread aerosols, more than 20 litres of them, over a distance of 300 kilometres. While in flight. A copy of this letter was disseminated by us on the 19th of April in the document collection that we had then. This system, given the distance of the flight, would represent a real threat of the broad use of dangerous bioaerosols across the territory of the Russian Federation. There is information that in January this year, Ukraine, through intermediaries, received more than 50 such devices equipped with systems to spray biological and chemical substances. On the 9th of March this year, 3 such drones equipped with 30-litre containers and spray systems were found by our military in the Kherson region. A further 10 were noted at the end of April in Kakhovka region. Our Ministry of Defence has received shocking evidence that a number of projects which the Pentagon is carrying out on Ukrainian territory represent risk to the life and health of volunteers, Ukrainian citizens. The documentation on the project UP8 stipulates that when there are small incidents with the people involved, then these must be reported to the US Bioethics Committee within 72 hours. And when there are serious events, including the death of the volunteers, within 24 hours. In other words, these experiments from the outset stipulate that they might be lethal, even though in the official project documentation it simply says that there's a standard procedure to collect blood. What kind of blood samples are being taken when the subjects might actually die? There is also evidence of the direct involvement of the political establishment in the United States in financing the military and biological activities in Ukraine through subcontractors from the Pentagon, such as Black & Veatch and Metabiota. The aims, however, were far from scientific. In a letter from the Vice President of Metabiota in particular, it says that its aim in Ukraine was to guarantee, and I quote, the cultural and economic independence of Ukraine from Russia, end quote. To put it mildly, this is an unusual objective for a biotech company. In previous meetings, we informed the Security Council that in Ukraine, with the financing and direct involvement of the US Ministry of Defense through its Defense Threat Reduction Agency, there is a network of biolaboratories that are carrying out various pieces of military biological research. According to preliminary data, this network covers Kiev, Odessa, Lvov, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, Ternopil, Uzhgorod and Vinnytsia. In this list, we can now add Mariupol. There are 2 biolaboratories in the city where we found evidence of the speedy destruction of documents that confirm that it was working with the American military establishment. The preliminary analysis of the documentation shows that in Mariupol, it's being used as a regional centre for the collection and for a passport system for cholera pathogens. The samples that were collected were sent to the Centre of Public Health in Kiev, which has the function to further then send on the biomaterial to the United States. This activity has been going on since 2014, as confirmed by the documents covering the distribution of the samples. There's also a health epidemiological laboratory in Mariupol, where we found a document suggesting that a collection of pathogen were destroyed, and that document's from the 25th of February 2022. According to it, there was work with cholera pathogens, also pathogens for deer fly fever, anthrax, in other words, with various potential bioagents. Part of the connection of a veterinary laboratory wasn't destroyed in a hurry. Their specialists found pathogens which aren't really usual for veterinary illnesses, such as typhus, paratyphus, and gas gangrene. Last time we talked about the sharp increase in recent years in the Lugansk and Donetsk republics of cases of tuberculosis caused by new, different, multi-resistant samples. We've also grounds to understand that this is not by chance that this has happened. There was also a bio-incident which took place in 2020 in in a region of Lugansk. There, it turned out that among children in Stepovoye, we found false money, which were then used as a carrier for tuberculosis. There, the idea was that the children, when touching this money, would then pick it up on their unwashed hands. The analysis showed that this money was infected with a bioactive tuberculosis, which would resist the various different medications that could be used against tuberculosis. The idea that the bacteria naturally ended up on these pieces of money is not true. The concentration of the pathogen was too high, which wouldn't be found in natural conditions where there is sunlight and where there is also active bacteria could die. In other words, there's everything to suggest that this was a laboratory infection of this money with the bioagent itself. Fortunately, nobody was a victim of this, but on the whole, we can see that this is a confirmation of a very worrying trend. I'd also like to get into another subject, which is another clear demonstration of how, in fact, the Kiev regime and its Western sponsors think about the Ukrainian people. There is evidence that American scientists from a laboratory in Merev have carried out experiments of potentially dangerous biological substances on patients in a local psychiatric hospital, Hospital Number 3 in Kharkov. Similar inhumane experiments took place in psychiatric hospital number 1 in Strelets in Kharkov region. The main category of the patients there was a group of patients who were men aged between 40 and 60 with very severe physical problems. All of this research was carried out secretly, and Ukrainian colleagues signed a non-disclosure agreement. To cover the American experts, they were brought in through third countries so that it was kept secret. As the information comes in about the activities of biolaboratories in Ukraine, we have questions to their allies, the United States, and through NATO. New documents show that between 2016 and 2019, military epidemiologists from the Institute of Microbiology and the Bundeswehr, the German army, in other words, they brought in samples of blood from their citizens who living in 25 different regions in Ukraine. What was the aim for the German armed forces to be involved in collecting samples from Ukrainian citizens? There's also documentation that confirms Poland's involvement, together with the key contractors from the Pentagon, in particular the American company Betel, through biological research on Ukrainian territory. Mr. President, I think that today, once again, we will hear from our Western colleagues that there will be accusations that this is propaganda and there's a lack of evidence. This is why we are devoting a great deal of attention to documentary evidence and to regularly distributing through the Security Council and the General Assembly the originals of these documents, which have come into the hands of our Ministry of Defence. With them, everybody can read these documents. There are hundreds of pages of documents signed by specific people, specific officials in the US and Ukraine. They show that they wanted to hide from the international community what the Kiev regime and Western colleagues were doing. American representatives have refused to give explanations about the character and the real aims of their activity in the biological sphere in Ukraine and around the world in a whole. In a preparatory document to the 9th Review Conference of the Biological Weapons Convention in Geneva at its session in the beginning of April, the Americans once again did not give any clear answer, besides waving away the idea that the biological activities of the United States by definition were peaceful and useful for the international community. On the 6th of April, there was a meeting in the Area Formula where there were independent journalists who asked for clarification from the United States, including about why documents about American-Ukrainian cooperation on biodevelopments contradicted the statements of American officials. But the delegations of the United States and the United Kingdom simply didn't come to that meeting. There's another very salient fact here. During the course of the meeting that I mentioned, of the preparatory committee, the US delegation once again rejected the proposal to create an effective verification mechanism for compliance with the BWC. They refused to renew work on a corresponding legally binding protocol to the convention, which the USA has been blocking since 2001. Our initiative was to add trust measures to the CWC through reporting on military biological activity beyond national territory, but the American representatives also rejected this proposal. In other words, the United States is deliberately blocking attempts to strengthen the BWC regime, aimed to allow it to effectively keep violating the convention. All of these are very worrying signals, especially given that the American legislation allows for military biological activity, and the national legislation in this sphere has prevalence over the international legislation in the United States. I'd once again like to ask the representatives of the United States, if your wishes for biological laboratories to exist around the world, and in particular in Ukraine, as you say, then if this is truly peaceful, then why do you refuse to deliver them to international controls, and why do you impede the idea that the international community would have the necessary instruments for that control? This would be the simplest way to once and for all get rid of all doubts and accusations if, as you assert, they are completely foundless. Unfortunately, we simply only have another explanation, which is that you have something to hide. Colleagues, we have already accumulated a lot of materials that directly indicate that the United States and Ukraine are violating the BWC rather. We continue to collect these materials and analyze them. Given that the American party is refusing to engage in any constructive discussion on this subject, we plan to utilize the mechanism stipulated in Articles 5 and 6 of the BWC. As soon as work to collect the materials is completed, we will present them to the Council for an investigation. We hope that this will allow us to finally cut off the military biological activity which threatens international peace and security, and to bring those who are guilty to account. Thank you very much.
In my role as Council President, I thank the representative of Russia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish I could thank the Department of Disarmament Affairs for their update information, but I'm afraid this falls short because we heard nothing new. And this is not their fault. I will nonetheless thank them for their patience to come here and repeat again and again for the third time in few months what we have heard in the two previous meetings, and that is that the United Nations is not aware of any biological weapons program in Ukraine, and they are not able to give any credit to the claims from Russia. They must be surprised that we keep asking them the same question on the same issue, hoping to have a different answer. Therefore, I'm seriously wondering if we need to continue to spend time for such nothingness. And I say so with due respect, since it is difficult to take this persistence seriously. With the world in turmoil, we should be able to devote our time to other pressing issues which need our attention and the action of this Council. Dear colleagues, this Council, we all rely on the UN reports on all issues we discuss here. We listen carefully to the information provided by the distinguished briefers from the Secretariat. We trust them because they do what we have asked them to do. And here we are, for the third time, we are presented with the same unverified, uncorroborated, unsubstantiated, non-factual claims for a non-existent biological program in Ukraine. It is therefore hard not to conclude that we are yet again in a persisting attempt to spread a false narrative, use the Security Council for propaganda purposes, divert attention from the terrible reality of crimes committed in Ukraine. This must stop. It affects the Council's credibility and relevance. Let me recall the famous saying that one can fool some of the people all the time and all of the people sometime, but one cannot fool all the people all the time. Dear colleagues, we have no doubts that Russia knows better regarding chemical weapons and their use. Its protégé, the Syrian regime, used them against rebel forces. Chemical weapons played a decisive role in the campaign of the Russian regime to suppress resistance in rebel-held cities, killing and incapacitating fighters and civilians alike. Let's not forget that the sarin gas attack in 2013 in the eastern Ghouta region near Damascus may have caused the death of some 1,400 people. And credible reports indicate that the regime has not abandoned this despicable behavior. This experience, the Syrian experience, reveals a troubling truth that when you are in a protracted war, when the attacking forces are trying to break the will of those defending, chemical weapons are one hideous, terrorizing weapon to achieve that. We hope no one, not Russia, not any country, will ever come to that point. Dear colleagues, issues related to chemical and biological weapons should never be taken lightly, and we never do. We listen to the Russian colleague, but we remain unconvinced, and there is good reason for that. There is a solid international normative framework, and we know how it works. The Biological Weapon Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention contain precise measures and protocols to which concerned state parties can have recourse to address situations for any suspicious or problematic activity. Therefore, if there were reasonable doubts for any allegations on any biological program in Ukraine, we have a path and should make use of it rather than come here with ill-conceived stories. As a state party of the Biological Weapons Conventions, Russia may take the issue to the OPWC, address them properly and professionally by providing the opportunity to national and independent experts to investigate. Mr. Markram reminded this again. Mr. President, as the French say, il n'y a pas de fumée sans feu. But in this case, there is no smoke because there is no fire, since there is nothing true. Documents have been distributed earlier, but no one from the scientist community has substantiated any of them. There is a smokescreen, and as we all know, smoke screens are fake and they do not last. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement. There's been a change in our list of speakers, so I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to start my remarks by expressing my compassion and condolences to our colleagues from the United Arab Emirates on the decease of their colleagues. May his soul rest in peace. Dear colleagues, this council met on the 11th of March to discuss the risks of using chemical weapons in the war in Ukraine. Our meeting quickly turned into an exchange between various delegations who were reciprocally leveling serious accusations at each other, designed to inspire the greatest fear for humanity. We hope it won't be the same today, but fear it might. It's terrible to consider the specter of the use of biological weapons as if bombing and the innumerable deaths that ensue, destruction of civilians and civilian infrastructure, were not enough. Humanity certainly does not need to be more fearful or to be killed by our incapacity, or the incapacity of this council, I should say, to stop this war in Ukraine and to stem the wars around the world which prey on our people. Sir, We need to look at the substance of the issue of dignity and security for people around the world, which is this security's job, without having unending cycles of intimidation and propaganda where information is difficult to distinguish from disinformation. This council cannot be the epicenter of fear for the world, and even less can it be a place where powers fight each other. It needs to be the highest place where the specter of war is exercised and where the scion of security and dignity for people of the planet exists. Dear colleagues, my country observes with great concern throughout our meetings on the war in Ukraine the hardening of positions, accusations, and verbal escalation of verbal warfare. The different parties take positions and contribute to exacerbate on a daily basis the situation of millions of innocent civilians who continue to pay the highest price. As a state party to the United Nations Convention on the Prohibition of Biological Weapons, we reaffirm our opposition to the use of any form of biological weapon and appeal to the warring parties to refrain from resorting to such weapons and to strictly adhere to the relevant provisions, especially Article 5 and 10 of the Convention on Biological Weapons and its regime. We would underscore the opportunity here of activating Resolution A/42/37 of the General Assembly, bolstered by Resolution 620 of the Security Council, that recognizes the Security General's ability to launch an initiative to initiate investigations on the use of biological weapons or risk thereof of parties to the convention. We absolutely need an impartial and independent investigation into the allegations that have been proffered. Dear colleagues, Gabon would reiterate its attachment to the peaceful settlement of differences and disputes between member states of the United Nations and continue to call on the parties to de-escalate the conflict and take all diplomatic opportunities, seize them to engage in good faith in negotiations to put an end to this war. To conclude, we would reiterate our appeal to the belligerent parties to cease all combat and call upon all parties to endeavor to silence weapons and give a chance to peace and peaceful cohabitation. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, I would like to thank Mr. Marc Macron for his briefing. I deplore the fact that Russia is once again using the Security Council as a platform for propaganda. In order to justify a war which is unjustifiable, the one which it is waging against Ukraine, Russia is therefore multiplying unfounded and unsubstantiated accusations. It is repeating that there are biological programs, offensive programs underway in Ukraine. Let's be serious here and come back to the facts. The United Nations have clearly indicated on a number of occasions, and again today, that the organization has no information on this subject. None. Repeated dissemination of false information about biological weapons will not transform these allegations into a reality. Mr. President, this is not the first time that Russia is disseminating lies to create confusion and sow the seeds of fear and to especially cover its own responsibility. In 2011, it accused Georgia of developing a program of biological weapons without any evidence. For years now, it has been waging a campaign of disparagement against the OPCW. It did so mainly to protect its Syrian ally, but also to dissimulate its own chemical attacks on European soil. France is very concerned by the possibility of this disinformation campaign being a prelude to the use of chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine. No one should be fooled by Russia's purpose today. The Russian discourse and rhetoric is dangerous and particularly concerning because it comes from a state which is a depository state to the Convention on Biological Weapons. This convention provides for procedures for consultation with the state's parties, and we should focus all of our efforts on safeguarding and implementing this convention so these shocking weapons are never, ever used again in future. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. I would like to start by conveying my delegation and indeed Ghana's sincere condolences to the government and people of the United Arab Emirates for the demise of Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan. I also join previous speakers in thanking the Deputy High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Thomas Markram, for his briefing. We have taken due note of the information provided. Mr. President, like others, Ghana is deeply concerned that the conflict in Ukraine continues unabated and the cessation of hostilities remains elusive despite ongoing human suffering and the loss of precious lives, including that of women and children. We also take seriously every report of the threat of use or the potential use of biological or chemical weapons, and know that in all instances of chemical and biological activity, the independent and impartial investigations conducted by the internationally recognized and mandated bodies should be the only way to establish the facts. The cruelty associated with the use of biological agents and toxins as instruments of war, and the fact that related diseases would not confine themselves to national borders, justify the prohibition of member states under the Biological Weapons Convention from the use of biological agents and toxins as instruments of war. Ghana reiterates its call for both parties to exercise restraint and avoid the deliberate or accidental release of chemical or biological agents and other WMDs, given the immeasurable risk these weapons pose to the lives of civilians and the environment. Historical events such as the Chernobyl nuclear disaster and its lasting impacts present enough evidence that averting the chances of a nuclear war in Ukraine and beyond will not only be in the interest of both parties, but also in the interest of the global community. The risk of a nuclear exchange is real and will be catastrophic for the whole planet. Its effects will not only be felt in Europe, but around the whole world. We therefore call on all actors to uphold their obligations and commitments under international law and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Ghana believes that the cessation of hostilities in Ukraine will not only be beneficial to both parties, but will bring much-needed respite to the global economy, especially to developing countries and small economies, which have borne the disproportionate impact of the ripple effects of this war, while struggling with the socioeconomic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. In conclusion, I wish to reiterate that a sustainable solution to the conflict can only be arrived at through diplomacy and constructive dialogue among the parties and stakeholders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. First, let me express our deepest condolences to the people and government of the UAE on the passing of their president. I thank the Deputy High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Thomas Markram, for his briefing. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Markram repeated what we have previously heard from the High Representative, that the United Nations is not aware of any biological weapons program in Ukraine. We're once more witnessing the Russian Federation using the Security Council as a platform for disinformation and to draw attention away from its unprovoked, unjustified, and irresponsible warfare in Ukraine. Norway is a firm supporter of the Biological Weapons Convention, and we're determined, together with international partners, to uphold the total ban against biological weapons. Therefore, let me be clear. Allegations of violations of the BWC are extremely serious and merit scrutiny. Yet once again, Russia has failed to offer any credible evidence for its accusations, providing us instead with unsubstantiated claims and mere insinuations. If Russia is serious about these accusations, they should use the proper procedure under the BWC and provide fact-based evidence. In the meantime, we urge Russia to stop wasting this Council's time and resources on these meaningless meetings. President, let me end by reiterating Norway's condemnation of Russia's war against Ukraine. It is a blatant violation of international law and the very principles of the UN Charter. We demand that Russia immediately ends its aggression, withdraws its troops, and stop causing death, suffering, and destruction. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, President. I thank Mr. Makram for his briefing this morning. We also would like to express our deepest condolences to our UAE colleagues, the government and its people for the passing of the President. Mr. President, I reaffirm Kenya's firm belief that the use or threat of use of weapons of mass destruction by anyone at any time is appalling and can never be justified under any circumstance whatsoever. The indiscriminate scope and nature of the deployment of such weapons will inevitably lead to immediate and long-term catastrophic effects on people, societies, and the environment. And indeed, even the users of such weapons of mass destructions may not be spared their rich and devastating effect. The Convention on the Production, Prohibition, and Development and Stockpiling of Biological and Toxin Weapons and their destruction remains the global norm against biological weapons and fundamental pillar of international community's efforts to prevent the use of such weapons. As a state party of the BWC, Kenya believes that any allegation of its breach must not be taken lightly. We also reiterate the need for all state parties to make the necessary efforts to strengthen the BW regime and the norms that safeguard humanity from the threat and use of these repulsive weapons. Kenya further reiterates its call to all state parties to the Convention to make use of the established mechanisms to ensure there is no ambiguity on the presence of these extremely dangerous weapons. Mr. President, without downplaying the importance of the matter under consideration, we all acknowledge that the matter of immediate concern of the Security Council is the armed conflict in Ukraine. This war is dangerously unfolding with unthinkable cost to the people of Ukraine and increasingly to the entire region and the world. We therefore reiterate our call to the Council and all its members to focus its efforts to finding a path to negotiate peace for Ukraine and its people who are bearing the brunt of this conflict. Once again, Mr. President, we implore for a cessation and meaningfully safe humanitarian passages for trapped civilians, particularly in eastern Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Before I start my remarks, I'd like to extend our condolences to the UAE for the passing of its president. May he rest in peace. I'd also like to thank Mr. Markham for his briefing and to take note of the United Nations once again repeating that it has no knowledge of the existence of any biological weapons programs in Ukraine. In keeping with the conviction of a long tradition in my country against all weapons of mass destruction, Mexico categorically opposes any activity related to biological weapons. As well pointed out by the BTWC, the use of these weapons would be repugnant to the conscience of humanity. The BTWC is a fundamental treaty in the disarmament regime, and Article 5 of this instrument clearly establishes that all states parties are committed to consulting and cooperating amongst themselves to resolve any disputes that might arise, and that these consultations and cooperation can also take place through international procedures as appropriate in the context of the United Nations and in keeping with the Charter. Mr. Chairman, therefore, we should take advantage of these provisions and make use of them. The presentation of annual reports also is an important means of building confidence and providing certainty in the area of biological materials. Unfortunately, the Convention does not yet have a mechanism for verification, as is the case with the OPCW. We hope that at the next review conference, it can be used as a framework for promoting effective means of strengthening the prohibition regime for biological weapons, and that in a near future, we can provide the Convention with a mechanism for verification. Mr. President, Mexico firmly believes in safeguarding the peaceful uses of bio-research while also preventing the risks of proliferation stemming from a dual use. This is why we firmly believe in promoting all synergies between the Convention on Biological Weapons, the regimes for export controls, such as the Australian Group, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the World Organization for Animal Health, in order to develop public policies which are comprehensive and coherent. Mr. President, to the extent that attention on new risks related to biological weapons has grown since the beginning of the pandemic, and with some allegations that we've heard repeatedly, and where the United Nations has reiterated several times that it has no information to that effect, it's worthwhile mentioning that all international mechanisms to prevent proliferation of such weapons by actors who are non-state actors should be strengthened. We hope that as a result of an extensive review of Resolution 1540 currently underway, we might be able to agree on measures to strengthen controls, especially with regard to materials, equipment, and technology that could be used in a dual manner. I would conclude my remarks by calling on this Council to prioritize putting an end to the hostilities in Ukraine and the suffering of its people. We hope that the next time the Council meets, it will be with that goal in mind. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico for her statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. We deeply mourn the passing away of High Highness Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, President of United Arab Emirates. His Highness will be remembered as a great statesman and a visionary leader who modernized and empowered the United Arab Emirates. He laid the foundation of the transformation of India-UAE relationship. The heartfelt condolences of the people of India are with the people of UAE. May his soul rest in peace. Turning to today's subject, I would like to thank Mr. Thomas Markram, Deputy to the Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, for his briefing. India attaches high importance to the Biological Weapons Convention as a key global and non-discriminatory disarmament convention prohibiting an entire category of weapons of mass destruction. The convention contains binding obligations on states parties to never develop, acquire, stockpile, or transfer biological agents for purposes other than peaceful. We support full and effective implementation of the Convention in letter and spirit. We also believe that any matter relating to obligations under the Convention should be addressed as per the provisions of the Convention and through consultations and cooperation between the parties concerned. India has been underscoring the need for negotiation of a comprehensive and legally binding protocol, providing for an effective, universal and non-discriminatory verification mechanism to strengthen the implementation of the Convention by states parties. Mr. President, we remain deeply concerned at the worsening situation in Ukraine. We have been consistent in calling for cessation of hostilities and pursuing the path of diplomacy and dialogue to address the situation. In this regard, we support the efforts of good officers of the Secretary General. It is important to undertake these efforts, keeping in mind the need to respect the principles of the UN Charter, international law, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to start by offering the United Kingdom's deep condolences for the death of the President of the United Arab Emirates. Mr. President, I'd like to thank Mr. Markram for his briefing. As we've heard from the UN today, there is still no independent evidence whatsoever for any of these bizarre conspiracy theories. In the United Kingdom's view, this session is a complete waste of the Council's time. It does tell us one thing, though. The fact that Russia is trying to distract us with disinformation suggests that they know, as well as we do, that none of their other excuses for invading Ukraine has any solid foundation whatsoever. The simple truth is that Russia is responsible for this horrific war in breach of the Charter and for the needless deaths of thousands of men, women, and children. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, President. And first, let me express our deepest condolences to the government and people of UAE on the passing of President Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan. Our sympathies are with you. Thank you very much, Mr. Markram, for your very useful briefing. President, I would begin by stating that the use of biological agents or toxins, or indeed chemicals, as instruments of war is abhorrent. They are rightly prohibited under international law, and there can be no impunity for those who use them. It is essential that we collectively uphold the international legal norm against such weapons. Ireland looks forward to the BWC Review Conference and will work with states parties to further strengthen this key international instrument. President, it is deeply worrying that Russia is continuing to use this important issue in an attempt to justify unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. Despite the large amount of material Russia has shared, no substantive or credible evidence has been presented to support Russia's allegations. Rather, what we see are baseless and unfounded claims against Ukraine and others, including the US, from Russia to paint itself as the victim in the face of its horrific actions in Ukraine. President, quite simply, Russia must stop seeking to use the Security Council as a platform for its disinformation. Its actions risk undermining essential multilateral disarmament and non-proliferation instruments upon which all our security depends, as well as peaceful, legitimate cooperation and research supporting public health. Biological weapons threats do not discriminate between their victims, nor do they respect borders, carrying considerable human, social and economic costs. We must do all we can as global partners to ensure effective disease monitoring, detection, control and prevention. Efforts to misrepresent or undermine legitimate biosafety and biosecurity research in Ukraine and elsewhere are deeply regrettable and only weaken efforts to prevent and control future outbreaks. President, we again call upon Russia to immediately end its hostilities, unconditionally withdraw from the entire territory of Ukraine and refrain from further threat or use of force of any kind against Ukraine or any other state. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I wish to start by expressing our deepest condolences to the government and people of UAE on the passing of the President. I wish also to pass my condolences to my UAE colleague. I've listened carefully to the briefing by Mr. Makram, Deputy to the High Representative of the Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs. On the question of the weapons of mass destruction and biosecurity, China's position has been consistent. We advocate the complete prohibition and thorough destruction of all weapons of mass destruction, including biological and chemical weapons, firmly oppose the development, stockpiling, or use of biological and chemical weapons by any country under any circumstances, and urge the one particular country that has not yet destroyed its stockpiles of chemical weapons to do so as soon as possible. All states parties should scrupulously abide by the objectives and principles of the BWC. An impartial, independent, and professional multilateral verification system is an effective means to implement the convention. The BWC will hold its 9th review conference at the end of this year. We expect the states parties to take this conference as an opportunity to restart negotiations on a verification protocol to the convention, promote the early establishment of a multilateral verification mechanism, and effectively enhance global biosecurity. China notes with concern the new materials released by the Russian side. Biomilitarization activities put at stake international peace and security. And information and leads about biomilitarization activities, including the Russian materials, should be of great concern to the international community. China once again calls on the relevant party to adopt a responsible attitude by providing timely responses to and comprehensive clarifications on the relevant queries in order to dispel the doubts of the international community. We welcome an assessment of the documents disclosed by the Russian side by the international community under the framework of the Convention and the United Nations. Lastly, I wish to reiterate that the conflict in Ukraine has been going on for more than 2 months. The priority at hand for the international community is to step up efforts to stop hostilities and urge both countries to revert to the track negotiations so as to accumulate political conditions for negotiations. China supports the Secretary General in making efforts for peace. We urge all parties of the international community to try and accumulate positive conditions for peace between the two countries, rather than the country. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Before I start, I join other delegations in expressing my condolences to the government and the people of the United Arab Emirates on the passing of President Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan. Mr. President, we are taking due note of the information provided by the delegation of Russia and of the fact that documentation has been made available. I also thank the briefer for the information he presented. My delegation takes very seriously allegations of the existence of biological weapons. Such allegations, with the gravity that they carry, must be thoroughly substantiated and by solid evidence, which must be presented and confirmed by an independent and impartial authority, as foreseen in Article 6 of the Biological Weapons Convention. In 1972, the Biological Weapons Convention finally established clear obligations binding all state parties, never in any circumstance to develop, produce, stockpile, or otherwise acquire such weapons. The principle behind these prohibitions is simple: the right of parties to an armed conflict to choose methods and means of warfare is not unlimited, and certainly cannot encompass weapons with indiscriminate effects or of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. Unfortunately, 50 years after having adopted the Biological Weapons Convention, we still haven't been able to agree on a multilateral mechanism to verify compliance with the provisions of the Convention. The absence of such a mechanism hobbles the transparency of international biosafety and biosecurity research initiatives, as the international community has no effective means to discern between legitimate scientific and technological cooperation and possible violations of the prohibition against the development and production of biological weapons. Brazil favors the resumption of negotiations with a view to the adoption of a binding verification protocol that strengthens the implementation of the Convention and contributes to building trust among state parties regarding the exclusively peaceful use of knowledge and technology in the field of life sciences. The next BWC Review Conference represents a unique opportunity for us to re-engage in such discussions without delay. While such protocol is not adopted, we invite state parties to strengthen the confidence-building measures system established in the Convention's second review conference by sharing the widest possible range of information regarding research projects on topics related to the object of the Convention within and outside their territory. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United States. And let me begin as well in joining colleagues by expressing my deepest condolences to the United Arab Emirates on the death of its president, His Highness Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan. I thank Mr. Makram for your appearance here this morning and for the always credible, objective, and sober contributions of UNODA to the Security Council's discussions. But I also regret that you've been asked to join us today as part of this truly farcical conversation. As others have said, Russia is once again using the Security Council, using it as a platform to spout disinformation and conspiracy theories about Ukraine, even as Russia continues its brutal and inhumane assault on the Ukrainian people. Russia repeatedly debases the Council through these absurd meetings and endless claims about chemical and biological weapons programs in Ukraine that are categorically false and ludicrous. They follow a well-worn pattern in which Russian authorities accuse others of the very violations Russia either has perpetrated or intends to perpetrate. We should not lend Russia's outlandish claims any credence beyond watching closely for the possibility of a false flag, chemical or biological attack by Russia's forces as the Kremlin continues to perpetrate its premeditated, unjustified, and unprovoked war against Ukraine. We heard this morning fanciful claims about poisoned banknotes, secret treatments on psychiatric prisoners, non-disclosure agreements. It's as if the Russian delegation's talking points came from a bad spy novel. But what is not fiction, and what we must not forget, is that Russia has a long and well-documented track record of using chemical weapons, including in attempted assassinations and the poisoning of Putin's political enemies, like Alexei Navalny. It is Russia that continues to support the Assad regime in Syria, a regime that has repeatedly used chemical weapons. It is Russia that has long maintained a well-documented biological weapons program in violation of international law, including the Biological Weapons Convention. These actions are unacceptable, and we will not stand for them. I reiterate that the United States' position that any use of chemical or biological weapons by Russia will result in severe consequences. And we expect the Russian government to publicly and unequivocally state that Russian forces and its proxies will not use chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine or anywhere, ever, in accordance with Russia's international legal obligations. Colleagues, what we're seeing today from the Russian Federation is not the behavior of a responsible country seeking to address serious concerns in this body. Even the documents Moscow circulates don't support their allegations. This is merely an attempt to distract us from the awful violence Russia is perpetrating in Ukraine. It is an effort to make us turn away from the suffering inflicted by Putin's war, the horrors of Bucha, the brutal siege of Mariupol, and the bombardments killing civilians across the country. But the United States is not fooled, nor council members, and we are not going to look away. Instead, we will continue to hold Russia accountable, and we join others in continuing to call on Putin to end his war of choice. I now resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the UAE, the representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Once again, there are attempts to divert the discussion and to move the focus from the subject that we initially raised and to mix together chemical and biological weapons. Colleagues, these are different things. President, you talked about both, but we are talking about specific facts that we have uncovered and in specific documents that indicate that biological laboratories in the Ukraine and working with the United States are carrying out biological programs. We have distributed several hundred documents. There is specific data there, specific cases, specific companies, specific people. If you think this isn't enough evidence, then what is evidence to you? You don't answer our questions, not only within the Security Council. In our statement, we already said that the United States hasn't provided any information or clarifications about the nature of the real aims of its biological activities in Ukraine, including within the preparatory conference for the 9th Review Conference for the BWC in Geneva, which is a specialized forum. You're trying to pretend that nothing serious is happening. But unfortunately, that it is happening. And we want clarifications from you. We've mentioned which mechanisms we might utilize. We won't leave this subject. Your attempt to turn our specific objections to you and our specific questions into a common pathology in talking about Russian propaganda won't work. You'll have to provide specific clarifications about the criminal activity that you're involved in. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. The representative of the United Arab Emirates has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Mr. President, I take the floor to thank colleagues for their words of condolences to my country over the passing of our President, His Highness Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan. May he rest in peace. We thank you for those expressions, both here at the Council and bilaterally. And we've already requested from the United States Presidency to schedule a moment of silence sometime next week. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.